Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer and welcome to Write Better Stories. Joining me today is Pringle. I am going to make another video about Antkind by Charlie Kaufman to give some of my thoughts about what he did with that book and postmodern literature in general. And then actually at the end of the video, I'm going to have a general question about what you guys think about the channel. So look forward to that. But this book in general, I think is a little unwieldy because there are just so many things going on that it's very difficult to sum up in a video, for one, and then two, to even understand on a first reading. And so I'm just going to pick out a few different things that I'm going to talk about. One is this concept of the unseen that the book explores. Two is this interesting version of the film within the book that's like the Netflix release of this film within the book that differs from the original version that our protagonist saw. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the conclusion of the book where the character seems to have enlightened himself in some way or another. So let me dive in. One, this concept of the unseen is a dominant theme in the book, and it's very similar to some of the ideas that I explored in my Nightwood video, the longer edited one that's on my channel. And it's about the idea of showcasing marginalized identities in films and stories, and by putting them on the margins within the narrative in order to reflect the fact that they are marginalized. So in the book Antkind, the way that he does this at the beginning is that the protagonist meets a director named Ingo who shows him this 3-month-long film that largely showcases a lot of white people having distracting comedic antics in a stop-motion animation style. But then the creator, Ingo, also created a bunch of marginalized identity figurines and then buried them in his apartment complex. And the idea was that everything that is seen is showcased in the film. So you could look at this as the white people's privilege by being in the spotlight. And then everyone who is unseen does not get to appear in the film. So this kind of reminds me of some of the things that David Foster Wallace explored in Infinite Jest, some of James O. Incandanza's more experimental films, where I don't know if this was James Incandanza's or not, but one of the films in Infinite Jest is like a found film where you open a phone book and point to somebody's phone number and be like, that's the film. It's going on right now. It's more real than anything we could write. So it's like highly conceptual, absurdly ridiculous. You can't even watch it. But that is what is really fun. However, the book goes on, Antkind that is, to question whether or not the protagonist has a correct memory of the film. And he has to go to all of these hypnotists in order to uncover whether he, or not whether he, but he has to go to these hypnotists in order to help him remember the film. And it gets so absurd that he sort of loses touch with what the film was and the missing pieces, and that is a big part of his arc. And so I think in general, that aspect of the unseen is interestingly explored, but then it ends up being contrasted with another way of exploring that, which is when the protagonist ends up going to the world of the unseen. I forget how he gets there. It might have been through hypnosis. And then he comes back to discover another version of himself that has seen a different version of the film in which these unseen were characterized in a very Hollywood movie sort of presentation. And so the seen version of himself that he meets after coming back from the unseen is Jewish, whereas the original version of himself is always just mistaken to be Jewish. So this is just a funny thing that comes back several times throughout the book. But in the Netflix version of this film that he saw, it goes into this kind of funny way that Hollywood might demonstrate their exploration of marginalized identities. So rather than by showing them through this super conceptual framework that a film critic would read a lot into, by showing the unseen off of the film in that original version, the Netflix version has them um, basically as, let's see, they're two young African Boreas Hephaestion girls with sheathed penises and swords who are strategizing over a map. And so, like, they exist on this, like, realm between fire and ice, and they are these heroes of the story, these trans African women that end up setting everyone free and fighting for rights and recognition. And that's just really interesting compared to the way that the original protagonist remembered the version of the film that he saw, which he says, this is page 503, by the way, that Ingo understood that one cannot make a movie about the unseen without flying in the face of their very unseenness. He knew that the only way to show the truth of the societally unseen is to not show them. And then skipping down a line, it only shows white people, and it is in the very form of a relentless and distracting comedy. The disenfranchisement remains off screen. And so one of the ways that I think this book kind of spun out of control for me is that the original protagonist is shown to be such a neurotic and silly satirical version of a film critic that it's unclear if you're supposed to go with his version of the film and appreciate the fact that he remembers the film as being composed of dominantly comedic scenes where white people get the center stage and all the unseen remain buried in the yard of the creator, or if through demonstrating him as such a ridiculous figure, he's supposed to, or we're supposed to take that interpretation of the film as silly and absurdly conceptual, and then appreciate the Hollywood version more. And just to be clear, though, I don't think that's the central thrust of the book, this comparison between the Netflix version and the conceptual version that he remembered. But at the end, there is some sort of transformation that the main character goes under. And it has something to do with him being resigned to the fact that he isn't ever going to remember the film perfectly. It is something about the curse of being a human animal who has to move forward in time but rely on memory, which is working backward in time. And this is basically, I think, part of his revelation as a film critic, is that he isn't ever going to get like a satisfying, perfect memory of this film. And that's actually an element of his character too, is that he claims to have I think it's called an eidetic memory, which is basically a photographic memory. But then they go in to talk about how a photographic memory is a lie, that even people who claim to have it don't actually have it. And so this is kind of where I am getting to a point with this book, and maybe postmodern books in general, is that it's like I was given so many different things to consider about this book that even though he seems to have had a transformation, I really just don't know what to make of all of this. Is that there are some of the like funniest and most vivid scenes and amazing imagery in this book. Like the arguments that he has with the different version of himself after he comes back from the unseen are just hilarious. And like the absurdity and comedic moments in this film or in this book are so funny of him. Like at one moment he puts like a mop on his head in order to disguise himself, and someone calls him pretty, and then he like puts the mop behind his ears and is like really bashful and appreciative that somebody called him pretty. And him like disguising himself as a clown and developing a clown fetish. This in Antkind and in so many different postmodern novels, I think, is what keeps me coming back to read these books. But then on the flip side, it ends up getting so complex and so complicated with all of these different thematic threads and subversions that you just, I think by the end, aren't really sure what you're supposed to follow or supposed to take away. Now, to be fair, that's an element of postmodernism, is that in a lot of ways, postmodern writers are critiquing the idea of there being a central theme or a central moral to the story that they're writing. But then I think that there's something to be said for a story that just gives you what it's supposed to be about and then has this character learn a lesson. And so that's something that I really appreciate in the film White Men Can't Jump, which is like a very, very different set of explorations than, say, Antkind or a lot of other postmodern novels, is that White Men Can't Jump is about a guy who has a gambling addiction and an ego problem, and then he does a bunch of gambling and hustling in basketball and then suffers consequences because of it. And at the end, even though it gets a little bit postmodern in terms of him not necessarily like learning from his experiences, I think as a viewer, it's still a lot more clear and cohesive. And so this leads me to that question that I mentioned at the beginning of the film, or at the beginning of this video, is that I've covered mostly postmodern novels and ideas on this channel, and I think that I'm getting to a point where I'm like, I think I've done enough of that. I have explored a whole lot of that camp and set of ideas, and I think I'm ready to dive into some other stuff. And so for you as viewers, what sort of thing do you think I should get into next? What would be an interesting camp or genre or historical period, anything like that that you would want to see on this channel? And yeah, feel free to leave that in the comments so that we can talk about it. And yeah, make your best dutiful attempt to write better stories. All right, goodbye.